There comes a moment in every life when the noise of the world grows so loud it drowns out the sound of our own soul. We find ourselves chasing approval, chasing success, chasing connection, until one day we pause and realize we've lost something vital along the way. In that stillness, we begin to hear a quieter voice, our own, and in that moment of silence, something begins to shift, not outside, but within. Silence is a gateway to self-discovery. It is not merely the absence of sound, but the intentional withdrawal from the incessant noise of external expectations, inner chatter, and emotional turbulence. In the stillness of our own minds, we come face to face with what truly dwells beneath the surface: our beliefs, fears, longings, and shadows. In everyday life, we are constantly bombarded by these distractions, keep the conscious mind preoccupied and disconnected from the deeper layers of the psyche. As long as we remain outwardly focused, our internal world remains unexplored, fragmented, and misunderstood. When one chooses silence, not just environmental, but psychological silence, a profound shift occurs. This is not the kind of silence that suppresses thought, but the kind that gently observes it. In such silence, we no longer react, we begin to witness. We become the observer of our thoughts, emotions, and impulses, rather than being dominated by them. It is in this detached observation that self-awareness begins. One may start to notice recurring patterns, unhealed wounds, or suppressed desires that subtly govern choices and behaviors. These realizations are not always pleasant. In fact, they are often uncomfortable. But they are essential, for in acknowledging what we have long ignored, we begin the process of integration. The journey inward through silence also reveals that many of the answers we seek externally already exist within us. When the outer voices quiet down, the inner voice grows clearer. This inner voice is not dramatic or loud, it is calm, intuitive, and steady. It does not offer guarantees, but it offers guidance. It points not to what is easy, but to what is true. It is this inner knowing that leads to authenticity. And with authenticity comes the sense of alignment that many search for in the external world. Inner silence, however, requires courage. It confronts us with the parts of ourselves we might rather avoid, the unresolved grief, the hidden insecurities, the disappointments we pretend not to carry. In silence, the unconscious becomes visible, and what was buried begins to surface. This is the beginning of true healing. One cannot become whole without facing what is broken. Through silent introspection, these fragments begin to reassemble, and we move towards psychological wholeness. Silence creates space for the symbolic language of the psyche to emerge. Images, dreams, and sudden insights arise spontaneously when the conscious mind is not occupied with endless thinking. These symbolic expressions are the psyche's way of communicating truths that are deeper than logic. To understand oneself fully, one must learn to listen, not only to thoughts, but also to symbols, feelings, and intuition. Silence opens this channel. In this process of silent self-focus, we also become less reactive. The more we understand our inner landscape, the less we are swayed by external forces. What once triggered us no longer holds power. What once seemed urgent reveals itself as insignificant. We begin to respond to life with greater clarity, discernment, and grace. The decisions we make, the relationships we choose, and the paths we follow all begin to reflect our inner truth rather than our unconscious wounding or societal conditioning. External chaos reflects internal disarray. What appears as disorder outside of us often mirrors the fragmentation and misalignment that exist within. The psyche is not separate from the world we experience. It shapes and colors our perception of that world. When the inner self is clouded by unresolved emotions, conflicting desires, and unconscious fears, life begins to appear unpredictable, burdensome, and hostile. We encounter misunderstandings, failed relationships, repeated disappointments, and unexpected detours, not because life is inherently chaotic, but because our perception is distorted by the unresolved material within our own psychological landscape. The world outside often serves as a projection screen for our inner contents. When we carry resentment or insecurity, we tend to interpret others' actions through that lens. We suspect judgment where there is none, feel threatened where there is no real danger, or dismiss kindness as manipulation. In this way, internal disarray distorts reality. The unconscious seeks expression, and when not acknowledged inwardly, it manifests outward. Situations and people are drawn into our lives that reflect what lies hidden beneath the surface. This is not mere coincidence. It is the psyche's attempt to bring the unconscious into conscious awareness. It is common to blame external circumstances when life feels overwhelming. Yet often, what we interpret as outer conflict is the externalization of an inner battle. A person who feels torn between the desire to please and the desire to be authentic will often find themselves in environments where they feel misunderstood or taken for granted. The environment is not the root problem. It is a reflection of the unresolved tension within. Similarly, one who fears abandonment may repeatedly experience rejection or betrayal, not as a punishment, but as a reflection of the unresolved fear driving their unconscious behavior. These patterns persist until they are recognized and consciously worked through. The process of untangling internal chaos requires courageous self-inquiry. It is easier to blame others, to criticize the world, or to seek constant change in circumstances. But none of these approaches lead to peace. Instead, we must pause and turn inward. We must ask not only what is happening, but what part of us is responding to it. What belief is being triggered? What emotion is surfacing? And where does it originate? This kind of introspection reveals the deeper layers of the psyche, many of which have been shaped by early experiences, unhealed wounds, or inherited narratives that no longer serve us. When we begin to bring awareness and order to our internal world, our experience of the external world begins to change. We may still face challenges, but our response to them becomes more balanced, grounded, and clear. The same environment no longer feels threatening because we no longer carry the same inner turmoil. Where once there was resistance, there is now acceptance. Where there was fear, there is now understanding. The more we resolve within ourselves, the more harmonious and meaningful life becomes. Perception is not passive, it is deeply creative. The lens through which we see life is crafted by the contents of our inner world. Chaos outside is often a signal, a message, urging us to examine the chaos within. And once that inner disorder is acknowledged and tended to, the external world begins to reflect a new kind of order, one rooted not in control, but in inner alignment. Solitude is not isolation, but integration. It is a deliberate withdrawal from the world, not as an act of rejection, but as a sacred return to oneself. In the silence of solitude, we do not escape life, we enter it more fully. While the world often celebrates constant interaction, productivity, and connection, solitude invites us into a different kind of relationship, the relationship with the inner self. This space allows us to gather the scattered parts of our being, to reflect, and to become whole. To be alone does not necessarily mean to be lonely. In fact, solitude is the birthplace of the self, where we begin to understand who we truly are without the noise of others' expectation. In a world dominated by social identities and external roles, we are frequently pulled away from our essence. We become students, workers, friends, parents, citizens, each role shaping our behavior and thoughts. But underneath all these roles lies something more fundamental, the self that observes, questions, dreams, and desires. Solitude strips away these layers. It removes the masks we wear and the performances we give. In that quiet space, we are no longer performing. We are simply being. And in that being, the deeper truths of our psyche begin to surface. Many fear solitude because it brings them face to face with themselves. Without distractions, old wounds rise to awareness. Regrets, shame, forgotten dreams, suppressed emotions, all of these begin to emerge in the quiet. It is here that integration begins. Integration does not mean perfection, it means wholeness. It means acknowledging every part of ourselves, light and shadow, strength and vulnerability, joy and sorrow. The self becomes more complete not by denying what is uncomfortable, but by embracing it with awareness and compassion. Solitude becomes the space in which this encounter can happen without interference. In solitude, time changes its nature. It slows down, stretches out, and deepens. We begin to notice things we usually overlook: the sound of our breath, the rhythm of our thoughts, the subtle emotional shifts within us. The unconscious speaks more clearly here, not in words, but in images, impulses, and feelings. Dreams become vivid, intuition sharpens, ideas flow. The mind is no longer overwhelmed by external demands and begins to function in harmony with the inner world. This is the creative and spiritual value of solitude. It restores our connection to the source of inner knowing. Rather than creating distance from life, solitude connects us more deeply to its essence. We see our relationships differently. We notice what energizes us and what depletes us. We become more honest with ourselves about what we value and what we merely tolerate. This inner clarity becomes the foundation for making conscious choices. We no longer drift, we begin to steer, and we do so not to impress, conform, or compete, but to align our outer life with our inner truth. Solitude also teaches us boundaries. It reveals how much of our time and energy we spend on things that do not nourish us. In solitude, we learn to say no, not from defensiveness, but from self-respect. We become less reactive, less entangled in the dramas of others, and more attuned to our own path. And when we re-emerge from solitude, we bring with us a stronger, more grounded self, one that is less dependent on external validation and more rooted in inner clarity. The integration that occurs in solitude empowers us to re-engage with the world, not as fragments seeking to be completed by others, but as whole individuals ready to contribute authentically. The self grows in stillness, not in noise. Growth, in its most profound form, does not occur under the spotlight, nor does it make grand announcements as it unfolds. Rather, it emerges quietly, often unnoticed, beneath the surface of consciousness. In a world that equates movement with progress and noise with relevance, stillness is often misunderstood as passivity or stagnation. Yet it is in stillness that the most meaningful inner transformations begin to take root. Much like seeds germinating beneath the soil, the development of the self happens in the quiet recesses of the psyche, where awareness deepens and old structures of thought slowly dissolve to make way for something new. Stillness provides the internal space necessary for self-reflection. When the external world is momentarily set aside, the deadlines, the judgments, the expectations, we are finally able to hear the more subtle movements of the inner world. It is here that we come into contact with our true thoughts, not the ones we repeat out of habit or obligation, but the ones that arise when we are not performing. These thoughts may begin as questions. Who am I apart from what I do? What do I need but rarely admit? What am I resisting and why? These questions are the starting points of transformation. They are not always comfortable, nor do they offer immediate answers, but they invite the kind of honest inner dialogue that leads to authentic growth. Noise, both literal and symbolic, drowns out the signals from the unconscious. The noise of daily life, social interactions, information overload, the demands of productivity, keeps the mind engaged but disconnected. In such a state, the self cannot settle long enough to observe its own condition. Without observation, there can be no understanding. Without understanding, there can be no growth. Stillness, by contrast, allows for observation without judgment. It invites us to simply be, to witness ourselves without the compulsion to edit or correct. In this neutral space, patterns begin to reveal themselves. We may notice cycles of thought, emotional triggers, or subtle longings that have been present all along but ignored. These insights arise not through effort, but through presence. The still mind becomes a vessel for intuition. In the absence of constant noise, new ideas, images, and realizations begin to emerge organically. These are not thoughts we construct, they are truths we receive. Intuition is the voice of the deeper self, and it speaks softly. If we are too noisy within, we miss its guidance. But in stillness, we become receptive to the deeper wisdom of the psyche. This is not imagination, but a form of inner knowing that transcends logic. It is the kind of knowing that cannot be taught or inherited. It must be experienced. True growth also requires patience, which stillness naturally cultivates. In stillness, we are not rushing toward outcomes. We are not measuring our worth by milestones. Instead, we learn to sit with ourselves exactly as we are. And in that acceptance, change begins, not because we force it, but because we allow it. This kind of change is sustainable. It is not reactive or surface level. It is foundation. The person who emerges from stillness is not merely improved, they are transformed. There is a sacred rhythm to growth that cannot be hurried. Like the tide that reshapes the shoreline or the moon that pulls the ocean, the transformation of the self happens slowly, invisibly, and without spectacle. Stillness aligns us with that rhythm. It reminds us that everything essential takes time and that the most meaningful shifts are often those that no one else can see. When we honor stillness, we step into the deeper work of becoming, not who we think we should be, but who we are already in the process of becoming. Authenticity emerges through detachment from the crowd. In the constant pull of collective thought and cultural expectation, the individual self often becomes entangled in roles, masks, and performances. We are social beings, conditioned from early life to seek approval, to belong, and to adapt ourselves in ways that ensure inclusion and acceptance. This instinct, though vital for survival in early development, gradually obscures our sense of personal truth. We begin to mistake the opinions of others for our own, measure our worth through external validation, and shape our identities according to what is rewarded by the group. In doing so, we risk losing touch with our inner compass. To reclaim authenticity, one must first loosen the grip of these external forces. Detachment from the crowd is not an act of rebellion or superiority. It is an act of return, a quiet commitment to rediscover who one truly is beneath the noise of consensus. The crowd can take many forms. It can be society at large, family expectations, peer groups, digital platforms, or even internalized ideals absorbed unconsciously over years. These influences create powerful currents that subtly direct behavior, beliefs, and ambitions. They tell us what success looks like, what to desire, what to fear, and who to be. Over time, we begin to identify with the image that pleases the crowd, and this image becomes a mask. The more we wear it, the more distant we feel from ourselves. We sense a dissonance between who we are and how we appear, but we fear that removing the mask will lead to rejection or loss. This fear is the very mechanism that sustains inauthenticity. To detach from the crowd is to face this fear. It is to willingly step into a space of uncertainty, where familiar roles no longer define us. It is often accompanied by discomfort, solitude, and a temporary sense of disorientation. Yet within this space lies the opportunity for clarity. When the voices of others fade, the voice of the self begins to speak. At first it may be faint, hesitant, and unfamiliar, but with time, attention, and care, it grows stronger. We begin to discern which beliefs are truly ours and which were adopted unconsciously. We identify desires that have been long buried under obligation and fear. We question the life paths we have pursued, whether they were chosen freely or merely followed. Authenticity is not created. It is uncovered. It exists beneath layers of conditioning, waiting to be remembered. And it is not static. It is a dynamic unfolding that requires constant listening. As we become more authentic, we also become more whole. We no longer split ourselves into acceptable and unacceptable parts. We learn to hold our contradictions with compassion, knowing that they are all aspects of the same self. This wholeness generates a kind of internal alignment that radiates outward. Our words, choices, and actions begin to match our inner truth. We feel less need to impress, to compare, or to prove. Instead, we begin to express, not to gain approval, but because expression is a natural extension of being. The detachment from the crowd does not imply isolation from others. In fact, it creates the conditions for deeper, more genuine connection. When we are no longer performing for acceptance, we invite others to meet us as we are. Relationships formed in authenticity are rooted in mutual recognition rather than projection. They are not based on roles, expectations, or convenience, but on shared truth. Such relationships nourish rather than drain, affirm rather than control. In returning to ourselves, we paradoxically find that we can be more present with others. We engage not from a place of need, but from fullness. The world may not always understand or applaud this authenticity, but it will respond to it with a kind of quiet respect, and most importantly, the self responds to it with peace. True alignment attracts without effort. When a person is inwardly centered and emotionally congruent, there is no longer a need to chase, persuade, or manipulate outcomes to feel validated or fulfilled. This state of alignment, where thought, emotion, and action resonate with the core of one's being, generates a quiet magnetism. It is not loud or performative, and it does not demand recognition, yet it naturally draws toward it the people, opportunities, and experiences that are in harmony with the individual's authentic self. This attraction is not based on force or control, but on presence and integrity. In a fragmented state, we often pursue things out of insecurity or fear. We strive to be noticed, to be chosen, to succeed, not because these pursuits are rooted in inner truth, but because we fear what we might be without them. This anxiety-driven pursuit creates friction. It sends mixed signals into the world because it stems from a place of lack. The energy behind such efforts is often desperate, even if disguised as ambition. People sense this dissonance, often subconsciously, and may feel repelled or confused by it. Situations may collapse unexpectedly. Relationships may feel strained despite outward effort. This is because the outer activity is not aligned with the inner state. But when a person is in alignment, their actions become extensions of their inner clarity. They no longer act out of fear of missing out, but from a quiet sense of direction. They no longer speak to impress, but to express what feels true. This internal coherence creates a kind of still power, an unshakable confidence that does not need to shout. People who encounter such a presence often feel safe, drawn in, or deeply seen, even if no words are exchanged. It is not charisma in the traditional sense. It is resonance, and resonance cannot be faked. It arises from being whole, from having reconciled one's inner conflicts and embraced one's true nature. This effortless attraction also applies to timing and life circumstances. When aligned, one becomes sensitive to the natural rhythms of life. There is less resistance, less need to force things into happening. Instead of chasing what is not meant for them, such a person recognizes when to act and when to wait. They begin to trust that what aligns with their truth will unfold at the right moment. Right action arises spontaneously, guided not by anxiety, but by intuition. It feels like flow, not effort. It feels like readiness, not urgency. In this state, the individual is not concerned with comparison. There is no need to measure progress against others because the journey is inward, not outward. Success becomes redefined, not as a checklist of achievements, but as a deep and abiding sense of inner peace. From this place, even silence becomes powerful. There is no need to explain oneself, to be understood by everyone, or to prove anything, but the very presence of someone who is aligned speaks volumes. They inspire without trying, lead without commanding, and influence without demanding. This is the paradox of alignment. The less one tries to attract, the more attraction naturally occurs. The less one seeks approval, the more one earns respect. This magnetism does not rely on charm, manipulation, or strategy. It arises simply from being in harmony with oneself. And because this harmony is rooted in truth, what it draws toward it is also true. Relationships are more meaningful. Even challenges are met with greater resilience, because there is no longer war within. The outer life begins to reflect the inner order. Alignment, then, becomes both a destination and a path, a way of being that brings life into coherence, not by force, but by truth. When you turn your gaze inward and learn to stay silent in a world obsessed with noise, you return to something eternal. You begin to shed the roles, the masks, and the borrowed expectations. In solitude, you integrate. In stillness, you grow. By detaching from the crowd, you rediscover your authentic self. And as alignment takes root within, you find that life begins to respond in kind, gently, without force, without effort. The relationships that matter find you. The path that is yours opens beneath your feet. You no longer chase, because you have become, and in becoming, everything falls into place.